Hello again, RGL3300 students. This one for obviously we're dealing with the slightly different subject matter. This lecture was to be on standardization, conformity assessment, and mutual recognition of product standards. It ties to last discussion we had on trade rules. You remember that we had the TBT and SPS agreement that tries to discipline how regulations can be done to be consistent with trade law. The next logical step would be to look at standardization, conformity assessment, and mutual recognition of product standards, because often what we're trying to do when we're dealing with trading partners is to try to reduce friction or trade barriers at the border. And one of the ways of doing that is to adopt international standards, which the TBT and SPS agreement advises countries to do to avoid trade frictions, but also to set up mutual recognition type arrangements with major trading countries. So you need to know, as a regulator, you obviously need to know a lot about international law, international trade law, but you also need to know about how standardization works in the international trade law system to reduce trade barriers at the border. And so that's what this topic is about. It also speaks a lot to post-market assessment because of so many products that come into our borders are manufactured not in Canada, right? But they may also already be identified as hazardous chemical products subject to our pre-market approval requirements and our post-market surveillance requirements. And so how does that work with standardization and mutual recognition is an important issue. Okay. Now, in the first part of the presentation, I speak to you about national product standards. But one of the things you need to remember is a standard is a document that outlines how a product should be made or performed, or a process or practice should be conducted with respect to the product. And typically most standards, well, all standards when they're initially developed are voluntary in nature, but as you've learned previously, a standard can be made legal by being referenced within a regulation, okay? So while voluntary, they can be made into documents that carry legal weight by referencing in regulations. Now, I go through quite technical issues that you can read yourself, but standards, whether domestic or international, help to reassure consumers that products, systems, and organizations are safe and reliable, draw on industry expertise and experience when developing regulations applicable to an available standard. And obviously, from a regulator's perspective, this is a tremendous advantage because, for example, say we're regulating the safety of electronic componentry so it doesn't, say, start on fire at night when people are sleeping or whatever the case may be. It's much better for the regulator to be able to reference a CSA or an ISO standard as being the threshold, the technical threshold that a product must reach for safety reasons, rather than governments having to develop all that expertise that can be provided by the industry and by a broad range of regulators from all of the different trading blocks, all of the different trading countries. To come together and agree that, okay, this is the standard for the product, to reassure consumers that product systems and organizations are safe and reliable. And so from the regulator's point of view, he or she's not going to recreate all of that work. They're obviously going to try to appeal to the standard, okay, because that standard has already been developed by the industry, the main players in the industry, and the regulators of all the major trading partners. So why would you sort of go in a different direction at that point, okay? And so again, standards can be very valuable to regulators. Now, standards are developed are developed by what we call as standards development organizations, but which are accredited. Okay, in Canada, they're accredited by the Standards Council of Canada to develop standards in Canada. Okay, the Standards Council itself, it oversees the standardization setting process within the country. It doesn't set standards itself. Okay, for example, I mean the main players in setting standards in Canada, the Canadian Standards Association (CSA), and there's a number of other smaller standards organizations. Now, certification organization is an organization that has expertise in methodologies for providing assurance that control systems conform to the requirements. In other words, Some organizations will develop standards, but some organizations take as part of their business, or in some cases all of their business, is their job is to simply test products before they come into Canada, or when they're produced in Canada before they hit the market, to ensure that they are in fact are consistent with the specifications of the standard. So we have standards development organizations, and we have certification organizations that determine whether the product has actually met the standard. Okay, and both need to be accredited. Okay, and accreditation is the formal verification, often based on internationally recognized criteria or procedures, of an organization's competence to carry out a specific function, whether that be a standards development or a certification function. Okay, I give you in the slides the directory of accredited standards development organizations and the directory of accredited product, process, and service certification bodies in slide 5. Okay. And the Standards Council of Canada, which oversees our standards development process, also attends all the major, and they arrange for Canadian experts to go to all the major international standard setting discussions with respective product standards, because no country is going to want international standard to be developed without trying to influence that, at least a major trading country like Canada, because you don't want any standard setting process, like all regulation, it can be political, any standard setting process to unnecessarily disadvantage your own industry. So the SCC attends the International Organization of Standardization meetings, or they arrange for Canadian experts to attend those meetings, industry experts, NGO experts, whatever the case may be, academics, it depends on the nature of the standard being developed, and to the International Electrotechnical Commission as well, another big one, okay, obviously dealing with electronic componentry. So when we adopt international standards within the way Canada's voluntary or regulatory legal requirements take place, we're obviously, it's in our interest as a trading nation to appeal to these international standards so that our products don't receive unnecessary barriers at the borders of our trading partners. Okay, and so often it makes a lot of sense for a regulator to appeal to an existing standard. And most Canadians are also aware of these standards. They're aware of ISO, say ISO 14,000 they see on the side of a building, or ISO 9000 they see on the side of the building for quality assurance and quality control, or whatever the case may be. Most Canadians will also identify if the CSA has certified something for, say, fire safety or whatever the case may be. They feel more confident about the nature of that product. Okay. And all countries, certainly major trading countries, have an interest in international cooperation around these standards to avoid trade friction and to maximize the effectiveness of regulation. Okay. So Government of Canada's policy is, by taking a strategic, proactive approach to achieving greater regulatory compatibility with key international counterparts, departments and agencies can reach policy goals more readily with lower cost to the government and to Canadians. Right? Obviously, from a regulator's point of view, it makes a tremendous amount of sense. International cooperation can also result in better informed decision making. You had all the industry there, representatives, experts from other governments and other countries there coming up with the standard. Why is the federal government of Canada, or even can the federal government of Canada, reproduce those pools of expertise in developing standards? Plus, when you develop standards that way, there's greater transparency and predictability, greater buy-in by the industry, greater buy-in by regulatory officials in other countries. And obviously, by adopting those standards, we reduce barriers to trade. Okay, very important issues. And Canada is very active in basically all of these international standard setting bodies: Codex Alimentarius Commission, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, International Telecommunications Union, you name it. Okay, we're pretty well active in all of these things. For example, the Codex Alimentarius is a collection of internationally recognized standards, codes of practice, guidelines, and other recommendations relating to food safety and production. Okay, so obviously, Canada, being a major trader of food products and importer of food products, is going to be around the table on that one. And so on and so forth. And you can see that in slides 9 and 10 quite clearly. And so, and the requirements for performance measurement of these standards and of regulations applies to the full regulatory life cycle. In other words, most of these standards will also embody a life cycle concept, the same way that the regulatory life cycle of any corporation, the product life cycle of any corporation should be assessed by a regulator, and the federal government itself developing a regulation development, a regulatory life cycle approach to all regulation development and review. Okay. And for that reason, we spend a lot of time focusing on performance requirements for standards as well as we do for regulations, including an aspect of that being our post-market assessment requirements for how well a regulation is working in preventing harms in society. The same thing applies for standards. All the standards are reviewed from a performance measurement, excuse me, and management perspective as we go down the road. Now, the TBT and SPS agreements actually call for international standards to be used, as you know, and that excuse me, is a way that we incorporate standards into our own domestic regulations, and international standard setting becomes a very important tool for a country like Canada, who's so heavily invested in international trade. Okay, but in order to bring effect to this, obviously there has to be some process for checking, right, whether the imported products are in fact adhering to the international standard. So we often find a situation where we need to have an infrastructure in place to assure conformity with the standard. Like, you know, I mean, having the standard out there is only effective to the extent that we can verify that any product coming into our borders or any of our products going out of our borders are in fact in conformity with the standard. And so there needs to be a rigorous process for doing conformity assessment, and that's where those certification organizations come in. For example, the Government of Canada may do random spot checks on these products and send them to a certification body that has expertise in product X area to determine whether the product is in fact in conformity or not. Okay, and that conformity is very important because you don't want any products that have the stamp or claim to have the stamp of a standard and then actually don't perform the way they're supposed to in your market, because then that undercuts the entire value of standards. Okay, so we have to have conformity assessment practices in place, and they're carried out by networks of professionals, regulators, and other stakeholders, including they can be individuals and organizations that produce import and market products. They can be doing their own standard conformity assessment. Organizations that conduct conformity assessments as their core business. Okay, consumer advocacy groups will often get a hold of these and have the capacity and be recognized as doing conformity assessment. For example, maybe public health groups and medical devices and things like that. Okay, and Canada's local, provincial, territorial, and federal governments are all involved in this work. Sometimes the product, for example, if you're importing a automobile or a motorcycle into Canada, they go to the River Road Environment Canada labs for conformity assessment. Okay, so that's a government body, but in some cases it might be a private research body, or it might be a public advocacy organization that's demonstrated that it has certification capacities. So it depends upon the nature, but they're all different things. They can be public, private, for-profit, not-for-profit. That's not what's relevant. What's relevant is they've demonstrated that they can do objective, they have the capacity, technical and otherwise, to do objective conformity assessment of products. And often those will be spot check products. For example, a bunch of containers of a new switching system come into the country. The government may decide to have 2 or 3 of those tested for conformity with standards, okay, and send them out to whatever export organization is going to do that work. All right. And so a certified conformity assessment entity can be charged with tests of the finished product or product samples, audits of the entire production cycle, back to the life cycle, to check whether proper procedures are followed. Inspections of the physical factory facilities to verify that the work environment is conducive to the proper application of standards. Classic example there would be pharmaceutical manufacturing. Okay? And once a product is confirmed to have adhered to the standard, typically certification will bestow a mark on that product, ISO such and such, CSA such and such, as visible proof that a product conforms to a specified standard or standards. Okay? And conformity assessment, don't mistake conformity assessment with mutual recognition. These are different things. Okay? Conformity assessment is when we all agree to the same standard. Mutual recognition is where we might have slight differences in our national processes, okay? But we mutually recognize each other's process as substantively meeting the requirements for each country, all right? That, for example, the adoption of the registration of pharmaceuticals in the U.S. and Canada may be slightly different, but there's mutual recognition that if something is approved in the U.S., it's approved in Canada and vice versa. All right? You still have to go through the process. You still have to apply for your license or your registration, but having passed the U.S. process, it's going to be much quicker in the Canadian process and vice versa. All right? And that's what mutual recognition means as compared to the issue of conformity assessment, which is really saying, here's a standard. Does this thing switch on the way it's supposed to? If we run it for 12 hours, does it not catch on fire? Whatever the case may be. All right. And when we're dealing with mutual assessment, you're just basically mutual recognition. You're basically saying our country reviewed your process, and from the purpose and objectives that we expect of our process, your process, well different, meets those requirements in any case. So therefore, we have a mutual recognition understanding. So if something passes in my country, it gets into yours. Something passes in yours, it gets into mine. All right? And that's what mutual recognition means as compared to conformity assessment. And mutual recognition is obviously really key, okay? Because finding that there's uniformity of safety, health, and environmental consumers requirements of a process will mitigate a lot of trade barriers. All right. So it's a process of finding that there's equivalence. There's an equivalency between your process and my process. Therefore, let's not cause each other problems. Let's just make sure that we're maintaining our standards. Periodically, that equivalency will be checked and determined, but usually regulators in each ministries know, like in Canada, they know what the US is doing anyway and vice versa. They know what the EU is doing anyway and vice versa. So it's an ongoing monitoring process to determine equivalence, okay? And once that's determined, then there's a mutual recognition understanding between countries, all right? So, and that's mutual recognition as opposed to what we're seeing with conformity assessment is usually speaking to kind of a process rather than and making sure that their process would achieve the same thresholds of risk aversion that our process would achieve, but they just do it differently, all right? So that's the key there with mutual recognition, all right? Now, why is this important? Because obviously things like standardization are a very big issue with respect to post-market assessment of all products. So if we can get standardization where products coming into our borders meet the standards that we've accepted as being an international standard, obviously that mitigates a lot of our responsibility for knowing what happened to the product before it reached our borders, and then we post-market assess post getting inside of our borders, right? And of course, international providers of pharmaceuticals and other chemicals need to comply with our post-market surveillance requirements in any case. So, but from an assurance point of view, from a pre-market approval point of view, a substitute for that point of view, adoption of the international standards becomes a very important criteria, as does mutual recognition and conformity assessment. Okay, so that's how they're relevant to post-market assessment, because we're not manufacturing it in our country. We cannot regulate the PPMs, the production process, in that third country. So when the product arrives at our border, it meets all of our regulatory requirements. It comes into our border. We have a greater degree of, if they've complied with a standard, we have a greater degree of assurance that from a post-market surveillance point of view, the product will reveal the characteristics of a product having met that standard, right? So that's the point. And that makes the issue of regulating of hazardous chemical products more manageable from the point of view of the flow of goods and goods across borders. All right. Now, we also have obviously an exam in this class as well. The same instructions have been posted. This exam is not the immediate week after the reading week, but the week after. But I want to read you one of the topics there to give you a sense as to what we're talking about with that exam as well. So you might want to listen up on this one. So, topic 1. 3 months ago, you took a new job in a Canadian-based regulatory affairs firm called Regulatory Obligations to Competitive Opportunities Consulting, Inc., ROCO. ROCO is so far operating in Canada and the United States, specializing in leading-edge technologies and practices for increased effectiveness and efficiency in regulatory compliance, government and public regulatory performance reporting, and corporate social and environmental responsibility branding. Okay? ROCO, being only 5 years old, already has over 100 regulation and branding professionals, plus support staff distributed in 4 divisions: chemical product industries, public and worker health and safety, food safety, and environmental protection. The firm is aggressively growing its business because it has committed substantial investor resources into technological innovation. Moreover, the firm has a relatively large budget for its internet presence, social media, and print advertising, but also sponsoring workshops for industry, free guidance publications, blogs, online free webinars, professionally produced YouTube videos, and providing expert speakers for sector workshops. Wow, this is one. Now, to your complete surprise, the manager of the Chemical Products Industries Division has tasked you with preparing a short paper, just a couple pages or so, he says, as a thought starter for him to develop a speech for the first ever joint meeting of the Canadian Chemical Manufacturers Association, Canada's research-based pharmaceutical companies, and the Canadian Generic Pharmaceutical Association. The topic of the joint meeting is managing regulations throughout the product life cycle, emerging challenges for chemical products. Wow, that sounds tough. Your manager's speech will be directed at providing a kickoff overview for the joint meeting's technical breakout group deliberations. He will do this by commenting on 1. A basic refresher on the chemical product life cycle, so everyone is using the same concepts and terminology. Oh, isn't that interesting? I wanted to do the exams to pursue your clarity on concepts. A general overview of technical regulations. What risks are being controlled by regulations as opposed to the regulation design approach, needing to be managed at each stage of the chemical product life cycle. Again, a general overview of technical regulations managed at each stage, needing to be managed at each stage of the chemical product life cycle. Okay? And then a rundown of new and emerging regulatory trends informed by government and public concern in the chemical product life cycle and the political, policy, and financial risks they pose to the industry. Okay? But fortunately, your manager primarily wants you to prepare your short paper on items 1 and 2, albeit he is open to any suggestions you might have on item 3, given your role in the company to focus on assisting clients with pre-market approvals and post-market surveillance in compliance with Canadian federal government regulations addressing hazardous products in the 3 sectors of pharma, agro, and industrial chemicals. So, a basic refresher on the chemical product life cycle, so everyone is using the same concepts and terminology. A general overview of typical regulations needing to be managed at each stage of the chemical product life cycle. That's the main guts of your response. Okay? So again, what I want you to do is no trick to the question. What I want you to do is use very effective 1,000 words or less to give what your manager needs as a refresher on 1 and 2. Remember, again, this is going to be a public speech. It's not something that you can use a bunch of regulatory techno speak. And you have to get the concepts right and clear. Okay, that's the purpose of the test, the exam. It's not to trick you with the question. The question will tell you what to write. What I'm interested in is how you write it, how you deal with the concepts, use them in the right way, and explain them in the right way. That's what the exam is about. Okay? So, this exam being 2 weeks after the reading week. We'll see each other on the Tuesday at 4 o'clock for RGL3300. And then when you're doing the RGL3300 exam in the second week after the reading week, I will see you at 4 o'clock in the same classroom for RGL3000. Okay? So in both cases, you've got a little bit more time to do the exams, okay? Because we won't keep you around for lectures in those 2 respective courses. All right? On that score, enjoy your reading week. See you in 1 week's time. Bye-bye now.